All right, thanks everybody. Thank you, Patty. I want to give you a scenario that is familiar to every Chicago tour guide. You finish up running your tour. It might be a boat tour, it might be an architecture tour, it might be a crime tour, but somebody gets off the bus and says, I'm from Rectum, Nebraska. I'm sure you know all about that. Then the next person off of the bus says, I'm from Tinkle Cent, Arkansas. I bet you know all about that place. And the next person, I'm from Tampon, Iowa, where Capone had his resort. And over, you've come to find as a Chicago tour guide that every small town in America has some story about Al Capone used to take vacations there, or he had a hideout there, or he had some kind of resort that he operated there. Sometimes this might have come from there was some gangster who had a resort there, and after a while people forget who that gangster was and just decide it must have been Al Capone. Or it could be just somebody found a tunnel someplace, or an empty room, or, I don't know, some empty bottle in the garbage or something. And this becomes a legend in a town that doesn't really have much else going for it. This is something that comes up not just in Chicago, but all over the country, and even works its way into real estate listings. A while ago, this one in Berlin, New Jersey came up that was advertised specifically as Al Capone's New Jersey mansion. I looked and looked trying to figure out where they got the idea that there was any Al Capone connection to this, other than just we think he might have used to take vacations around here and built a house like this one. There is also Al Capone's Northwoods, Wisconsin hideout. They operated this as a tourist attraction for a long time, the Al Capone hideout. Now, there was kind of near Corduroy, kind of by Cranberry Lake, there was a house that he had in the 1940s or so. There was a couple that his brother owned around there. But the amount of time he spent there was probably pretty limited, and it wasn't until after he was out of jail, really. Then there's this one, also someplace in Wisconsin, in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, a secret called Capone Home with secret rooms. It just had secret rooms. Evidence that Al Capone never set foot in the place. I have no idea where they would have come up with this. The reality of the situation is Al Capone spent most of his time ducking into the side entrances of B-list hotels. Something you hear all over Chicago is that Al Capone was here, Al Capone was there. It's almost never actually true. Often it's just, it starts out somebody saying, this place is old enough, Al Capone could have been in here. And then people kind of forget that there was a could have in there someplace. There are several different theaters that'll show you where Al Capone's booth was, as though he would have been bold enough to go to a theater very often to begin with. He was, a lot of people wanted to kill this guy. He kept a pretty low profile overall. But just as a couple of classic examples, we've got the Exchequer Restaurant, which formerly the 226 Club. It's a great restaurant. It used to say on their menu that it was rumored to be an Al Capone haunt. And then by about 2012, the menu said, after all, Capone just lived down the road. It's like a mile down the road. And currently their webpage says it is one of the few confirmed locations that Al Capone was a regular at. Where they confirmed this, I have no idea, because I've never seen anything suggesting that he went to the 226 Club. Of course, more famously, the Green Mill. It has been part of their advertising since the 1990s that Al Capone used to hang out in the place. They'll even occasionally show you the booth that they say was Al Capone's booth and talk about how when Capone came in, the band would switch to playing Rhapsody in Blue. The current setup in the place was built in about 1935. No booth in there is from early enough to have possibly been a place where Capone would have sat, and I've never seen anything from before about there's one thing from the 1970s, but that's about it. We'll get to that in a second, but it's something very common, and also as you get a little bit further north of here, really we're right about where it starts now, there's also a lot of stories that Charlie Chaplin lived pretty much everywhere. Charlie Chaplin lived in Chicago for 3 weeks. He was crashing on Bronco Billy Anderson's couch the entire time. The one thing everybody who worked with him at SNA remembered was how cheap he was. He did not buy himself a fancy apartment here. There's also, strangely, we still hear a lot of stories about Johnny Weissmuller, too, the Olympic swimmer who also played Tarzan in the movies. He's said to have been at most of the high schools and gone swimming in just about all of the pools. I often feel like one day, and their lifetimes overlapped enough that this could have happened, one day Al Capone, Charlie Chaplin, and Johnny Weissmuller just went door to door, poking their head into every door frame and going, hello, 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 goodbye. And then they went on to the next place. So technically they weren't all of them. I tried to get an AI machine to make me a picture of this. This is as good as it could come up with. Which, in historical research, AI is just completely useless. But once again, Al Capone did not really go to these fancy places very often. There were a couple of Italian restaurants around about where Halstead is now that he might have been a regular face at. It's hard to tell for sure. It is worth noting that it didn't make the news every time he went someplace in his early days in Chicago. If you live in Chicago, he lived in Chicago for about 12 years with some significant amount of time off. In 10 years, you go to a lot of places. Presumably, he did want to go to quite a few. Though by the time he came to power, he was mostly just hanging out inside of this hotel or in another hotel or in his place out in Cicero. We'd have an easier time with this in Cicero. But really, the question kind of comes up, like, why is Al Capone the gangster who became so famous? He's honestly not the most interesting of the 1920s mobsters that we had, but he is the one who made the cover of Time magazine. Now, I would say, I wish that we could tell stories about Irv Schlig. Who has ever heard of Irv Schlig? Now, Irv Schlig is a guy who realized, hey, liquor is still legal in Canada. They might be stopping people at the border, but you can fly right over that. So he bought himself a little airplane, took one flying lesson, and then started flying back and forth to Canada with liquor. Made a fortune for himself until one of the other gangsters killed him. And then you got Vinny the Schemer Drucci. This guy was always coming up with plans like, why don't we run one of our guys for mayor? Or why don't we go to London and steal the crown jewels? He used to dress up like a priest and have Dino Banyan, his boss, beat him up on Michigan Avenue. Just so people could say, like, man, don't mess with that O'Banion guy. I saw him beating up a priest on Michigan Avenue. And then, of course, there's Capone's original boss, Johnny Torrio. This is the guy who really built the empire. When Prohibition started, this is the guy who built the organization, who was running all of the brothels and converted them all into speakeasies, got everybody together and said, listen, we're not going to kill each other. We're just going to divide the city into territories. There's plenty of money for everybody, no reason to fight. And that actually worked for a couple of years there. But Capone was the guy who made the cover of Time magazine, and part of this is because he just gave better interviews than the rest of these guys did. Even the ones that he actually gave, he was very quotable, saying things like, yeah, it's bootleg when it's on the trucks, but when they serve it on a silver tray, it's hospitality. And he did such a great job of playing this Uriah Heep type character. I'm just a humble guy. I'm just a businessman, and for no reason at all, everybody's trying to drag me into something. Reporters knocked on his door on Prairie Avenue. He opened the door wearing a pink apron and stirring a pot of spaghetti. And, and it is exhausting always rooting for the anti-hero, but we all do it. And raise your hand if you wouldn't have been buying beer in Chicago during Prohibition. Come on, okay. What, the people who don't drink beer, maybe. But we all probably, none of us really think Prohibition was such a great idea anymore. We all probably would have been drinking, so it's hard for us to really be too against these guys. Honestly, among all of the gangsters who were operating in Chicago at the time, I'd take two of them over any given ICE agent being in my neighborhood. And also, Capone was very good at just public relations move like operating a soup kitchen. Around the time he went on trial, he was talking all the time about how he was running a soup kitchen that fed about 3,000 people a day, which was true. He did have this place at 935 South State for about 6 months or so. It was costing, he said, about $300 a day, but it later came out that he was shaking down all the suppliers to get it. So it wasn't really coming out of his pocket or anything, but sure, he could have just shaken them down for groceries for his own personal use, I suppose, too. And really, just for myself, he's a very interesting guy just to put the puzzle pieces together. One of them I was working on is another one of these stories. Besides his soup kitchen, there also tended to be just a lot of legends about him, like going into an ice cream shop and buying ice cream for all the children, or seeing somebody who looked broke, so he gave them a $1,000 tip or something. It's, this pretty boy Floyd type of stuff. Now, this is all over the internet that Al Capone is the reason we have expiration dates on milk bottles. I have no idea where this came from, but it's passed off as fact all over the place. Like in this case, after his niece became extremely ill from bad milk, no evidence of that, he lobbied aggressively, but somehow made absolutely no news doing it. In some cases, it was he moved into the milk racket after Prohibition. After Prohibition, he was in jail, so he wasn't really getting involved in the dairy industry. Now, his brother did invest in a dairy company, but it's still not actually a law to put labels on milk bottles like that or expiration dates. This is just one of those things that sounds like it ought to be true, so it goes all over on things like interesting as fuck or today I learned or any number of things like that. I know his grandniece says that it's true. She was 6 when he died, so... But even in as early as the 1930s, this guy had somehow captured people's imagination. It is kind of this great American story, the child of immigrants, 4th grade education, a shoeshine boy from Brooklyn who rose up to throwing bootleg liquor parties that had all the politicians present. Everybody was in his pocket living this lavish lifestyle and giving half of it all away to charity. This even came up, this is 1930, a Tribune reporter named Fred Paisley wrote what is probably the first Capone biography, Al Capone, the biography of a self-made man. He had never actually met Al Capone. And much of the stuff that's in here, to the extent that you can fact check it, it doesn't really hold up. There's one story about this airman from Italy landed and it was a really big thing, but they're worried that there would be like anti-fascist riots, so they brought in Al Capone to be on the stand there with him to keep everybody behaved. And the newspapermen were all just aghast. Why was this gangster up there on the platform? If Capone was there and the newspapermen were aghast, they were all very, very quiet about it. I pulled every newspaper looking for a mention of him being there, could not find a thing. Now, after Capone went to jail, in the night after he died in the late 40s, in the 1950s, you had The Untouchables, the TV series based on the book by Elliot Ness, the G-Man, who was one of the bigger self-promoters of the day. He was out of work and not really able to get much more work and slowly drinking himself to death. So he dictated this book that became a really big seller. It inspired a television show, despite the fact that people who worked with him in Chicago say he mostly just pushed pencils around. He was really just kind of a self-promoter, but the TV show kept the legend alive. And at the same time, in the 1950s, you had a lot of newspaper reporters writing memoirs. Now, unlike a lot of historians, I think that old newspapers are an excellent source of primary data. You got to get the right papers, you got to know how to read them and compare them to the other papers that came out the same day and get them organized and sorted, but there's a lot of really good data in newspapers. However, these same newspaper reporters' memoirs from the 1950s are possibly the least reliable sources on the planet. I mean, if one of them had written, Warren G. Harding is actually still alive. He's out in New Jersey. I just played croquet with him last week, in fact. We just said that he was dead because it made a good story. That would not be out of character for these kinds of books. It was what made these things sell, was telling, oh yeah, we just made everything up in those days. Everything was all fake. And most of these are so full of things that you can fact check, like the basic dates of when things happened, the basic timeline of like when Big Jim Colosimo was killed, when Capone came to town, when Torrio was shot. They'll get these things so incredibly wrong that you just can't really follow any of them. Now, in this case, this particular guy, Howard Vincent O'Brien, worked for the Daily News, and he's got 3 or 4 pages of this in which he works with Al Capone to write a real ghost-written autobiography. Capone was apparently so mad about the Fred Paisley book that he said, I want to tell my own real story. But every time that O'Brien interviewed him about anything, he would just say, oh, I can't talk about that. That wouldn't be fair to my people. Which is probably about what went on. And there is a letter in the Newberry Library, a handwritten letter from Al Capone to O'Brien authorizing him to write the autobiography. So there's some in there, but who knows how much of the rest of it he was just making up. There was nothing I could really use in there. Then in the 1960s and 70s, you had movies like The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a Roger Corman film. He's the guy best known for making all of those Vincent Price movies about Edgar Allan Poe things. He was kind of famous for being really cheap with his movies. He could really stretch a budget. If he finished a movie 2 days early, he's like, well, we got 2 days, we got a whole set here. Let's make a whole nother movie in 2 days. And he would do it, and the movie would probably be pretty watchable, too. In this case, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the guy he has playing Al Capone, it looks nothing like Al Capone, talks nothing like Al Capone, is nothing like Al Capone. The movie is still wildly entertaining to watch, though. And then in the 1980s, of course, The Untouchables was made into a movie with Kevin Costner and Sean Connery and a Chicago flag that was slightly out of date. It should have only had 2 stars in those days. So this, too, there really was a guy named Elliot Ness, and there really was a guy named Al Capone. That's about as accurate as this movie gets. But it is wildly entertaining. It's an excellent film. It just has no basis in fact. But it was right around the same time, a little bit before, that what we've just been watching in the pre-show happened. Geraldo Rivera vaults back on Capone show. Fallen star hopes special will rekindle career. How'd that go? Now, this, I had never actually watched that until fairly recently. Just last week, really, I finally sat down and watched the whole thing, and it was actually pretty entertaining. And really, there were some good aspects to it. What I knew about it going in was, I knew the legend of this special. I don't think I watched it when it was on. I was like 6. It was on at the same time as Newhart, so my parents probably had Newhart on, not this. And what I had always read was that all he found in the vault was an old bottle or something. Really, it was worse than that. The bottle is something he had found when they were first going down to the basement to check the place out. It's like he kept showing this bottle all throughout the special. Like, we found a bottle, and our archaeologists say that it's from Capone's time period. And then the rest of the special was all like busting through a wall that he said behind this is going to be this massive hollow space that was supposed to be the vault. Behind the wall was just another wall. He didn't even find a vault. And then at the end of it, he just kind of stands around and sings Chicago, Chicago a little bit, and then walks, okay, I'm out of here. That's clearly deeply embarrassed. I will just show, there's also the quick clip. George Newman, he starts where others stop. Sex with furniture, what do you think? Or the world watched in amazement. He's unlocked the mysteries of Al Capone's glove compartment. Aha! Road maps! This is a map of Idaho. If Al Capone had a map of Idaho in his glove compartment, that would be significantly more interesting a find than anything that Geraldo found down in the basement. But for all that, there's some interesting stuff in the special. Like, he got to interview Louise Rolfe, who was Machine Gun Jack McGurn's blonde alibi. At the time of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, officially Machine Gun Jack McGurn was in a hotel with a blonde woman that he later married so she couldn't testify against him. And she was still around in 1986. And so was Tony Berardi, the guy who took the photographs of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre scene, or some of them anyway. And he said, no, it was Machine Gun Jack McGurn. I don't care what she says. And also, one other thing that I think has really kept the Capone story alive is folks love tunnels. Talk to any tourist. People love a good story about tunnels, not just in Chicago, but half the towns I've lived in, there's been rumors about some kind of secret tunnel someplace. In Chicago, we have any number of lost tunnels that we know of. There was a tunnel under the river at LaSalle Street and another on Washington. There's about a mile of brick tunnels somewhere under the Gold Coast. And there's kind of a map of where they would be. They were from the 1850s that a brewer was using them to age his beer. In the late 19th century, kids would sneak in to play cops and robbers all the time, but their parents got word that there might be real robbers hiding out there, so they had them all blocked off. Last time anybody saw them is when they were digging out the basement of the Ambassador Hotel in the 1920s, but presumably they're still down there. It's kind of hard to get rid of a tunnel. And then, of course, we've got the freight tunnels down below the loop, as pictured right here. This is a thing where early 20th century, the telephone companies were about to bring out the big new improvement: phones with dials. They knew this was going to be a big thing, so they needed to get all of the cabling down underneath the city. And while they were down there, completely unauthorized, they decided to make these tunnels big enough that a push car could go through. Really, they were down there for pushing mail and coal and deliveries around. There are really tunnels all over Chicago that were for delivering groceries, delivering supplies. Gangsters probably could have used them too. You don't find a whole lot of evidence that they actually did. Now, these freight tunnels, there's about 60 miles of them. It used to be that every major building in the loop was connected to them. Especially since 9/11, they're really tight about letting people go down there. But Geraldo got to go. If I could organize tours of the freight tunnels, there's really not much to see down there, but if I could sell tickets to that, it would be kind of hard to do a tour. It's like the whole thing is pretty much the same. And there aren't really that many good stories about things going on down there. There's, in the Geraldo especially said, and there have been rumors for years that Al Capone used these tunnels. There was one story about a gangster using the freight tunnels in the 1920s. It was in about the mid-1920s, a police officer at City Hall, Officer Curran, came running up to his superiors and said, a gangster just shot my desk and now he's disappeared into the freight tunnels. So they got like 200 guys to go poking around in the freight tunnels trying to find where this gangster was. But then a couple of days into it, while these people were still wasting taxpayer dollars in the freight tunnels, Officer Curran came running up against him. Another gangster just shot my car door. And then after a brief bit of talking, they found out that Officer Curran had shot his own desk and his own car, and the whole thing about a gangster running down into the freight tunnels he had just made up. So he had to promise that nobody else will fire at him, as he was given a 30-day suspension with pay. Now, gangsters using tunnels are more often gamblers than anybody else. In the 1910s, before the Prohibition era, these things were really pretty common. Like, this is down in the 4000s of South Halstead. This is Big Jim O'Leary's place, the dark secrets of Chicago's impregnable gambling castle. Big Jim O'Leary was the son of Mrs. O'Leary, who took the blame for the Great Chicago Fire. He ended up becoming a big bootlegger. This is before bootlegging was even necessary. He was just a gambling kingpin, and he had a place on South Halstead that really did have hidden rooms and secret passages all over it. Now, he was still operating in the 1920s, too, and operating very openly as a beer salesman. The thing is, with these illegal speakeasies, they didn't really need all these escape tunnels or anything. They just bribed everybody. There's also down at 119th Street and Western was the Burr Oak Crime Castle. It was just known as the Roadhouse officially, but there were in fact tunnels here. There was a saloon up front, then there were some gambling halls, and then there was the hotel, which, you know, it was a brothel. But this place operated quite a while. It was run mainly by a guy by the name of Sam the Kinky Jew Harris. They called him the Kinky Jew because his hair was kinky. He actually died trying to rappel out of the criminal court building. He was being held there, found a length of twine in an officer's desk, and tried to use it as a rope to rappel down the door, and ended up falling and dying on the sidewalk. If he'd been the other kind of kinky, he might have been better with rope safety. But these 1910s guys had the best nicknames. This is a list of, where I first heard about him was this list of pickpocket nicknames that was published in a Chicago paper in the 1910s. Joe Putz, Joe Blue, Slim Divine, Humpy Hannon, Nobby Myers, Whiskey Pat, Kangaroo George Shine, The Count, Mickey the Jew, Shorty DeBear, Louisville Flynn, Haircut Pete, Baldy Walsh, and The Kid from Troy. Many of these are horribly problematic. They were probably just still using their old nicknames from when they were newsboys, honestly. Every newsboy had a nickname. Most of them were cruel and problematic. Then, another thing about the 1970s or so, starting in the 1950s through the 1970s, another thing that ended up being a major source of Capone mythology is musicians. Every musician who was active in the 1930s in Chicago, who was still around in the 1970s and 80s, was telling stories about Al Capone. This is a place I wish I believed more. This is that place on 31st Street that used to be the Sunset Cafe. It's currently a beauty parlor, but they still have a mural up on the wall from back when it was a jazz club. And Earl Father Hines played there for years when it was the Grand Terrace Ballroom. In this interview from the 1970s, he said, Capone just sat us down and said, we want you to be like those three monkeys. You don't see nothing, you don't hear nothing, you don't say nothing. And that was the whole arrangement. And whether he was telling the truth about this, I'm not the kind who would argue with Earl Father Hines. But every other musician had a story just about like this. In the Geraldo special, he talked to Charles Buddy Rogers. And Charles Buddy Rogers was a big band leader at the time, and his interview is really kind of hilarious just because of the way he talks. It's so old-fashioned. He's like a character from The Music Man or something. So, yeah, Capone and I, we were buddies. Took me to a hotel, big hotel. We were playing a gig at the Chicago Theater back in the 30s, mid-30s. Like, Capone was in jail in the mid-30s. And I looked up when this guy ever would have been at the Chicago Theater. It was 1929, summer of 1929. His story was, oh yeah, there was this guy who was a manager there, Motion Picture Leo, they called him, because he got Capone all of his motion pictures. And I was playing there. He picked up the phone and said, give me the big chief. Chief, it's Motion Picture Leo. I got Buddy Rogers here. You want to come meet Buddy Rogers? So they took me out to this hotel, big hotel. Would have been the Lexington Hotel. And he said, I want you to meet Senator so-and-so and Congressman so-and-so. And he was so nice to my mother. Only time I can find that he was playing the Chicago Theater was while Capone was in jail in Philadelphia. He got on the Geraldo show partly because I think he just wanted to be on television again. There's also, this is Jewel Stein, a composer who did a lot of Broadway shows, and he was active as a musician around Chicago in the 1920s as well. This 1970s biography of him that came out told a lot of stories about, he gave interviews to Theodore Taylor, the biographer, and talked about the time that he was hired to play his band at Capone's week-long party for, during the time of the Dempsey-Tunney boxing match. And he said, oh yeah, he would just come up and grab the baton himself and conduct Rhapsody in Blue. This may be the source of why we think that story about the Green Mill. Also buried in this, just casually, he does mention that he once saw Capone at the Green Mill. This is probably the only source of the legend that Capone was there, but also it's well documented that that party that Capone had for the Dempsey-Tunney fight was only 2 days long, not 7 days long. There's about 7 or 8 things wrong with just the one paragraph that he says about it. So, you know, it's not inconceivable that Capone might have been at the Green Mill. I also heard, well, one other thing that, another way that these stories come around, tour guides. Those jerks. And as in my capacity as a tour director for school groups, I get to go on a lot of other people's tours. And just before we started, I was looking on my phone, there's a tour company that had an article about 5 places Capone really knew. 1 out of 5 was correct. And I was on one of the bus tours, took us over to the Hilton and showed us, you can still see the S's from when it was the Stevens Hotel, and told this whole story about Capone had a massive party at the time of the Dempsey and Tunney boxing match at Soldier Field. That took place at the Metropole Hotel. It was quite a ways south of here, not nearly as fancy as the Stevens, and pretty well documented as such. But on the boat tours, about every other boat tour that passes the Jewelers Building, we'll say that Al Capone either owned or patronized a place called the Stratosphere Club up in the Dome. The Stratosphere Club was a real place. I got this matchbook from it a while ago. It had kind of a hot air balloon theme up there. It was the highest tavern you could go to anywhere. But it didn't open until 1937. Prohibition was long over by then, and Al Capone was safely in jail by then. There's no reason to think he ever would have set foot in this building. My favorite thing about it, though, the dome up at the top, you see like kind of in the corner there, I don't know how well you can see it on the TV screen, but it's several places here you can see the initials FD. That's the architect Fred Dinkelberg. He designed this one himself. He'd previously worked with Daniel Burnham, but never got any credits. Like, he was the principal architect behind the Flatiron Building in New York. There's plaques all over the Flatiron Building, and none of them mention Fred Dinkelberg. So he's got his name all over this place. There was something about a hawk getting stuck in the dome there in the 1920s, but nothing about there being any kind of a whiskey bar or anything until long after Capone left. A lot of pizza places, of course, say that Capone was there. This is the Giordano's at Farwell and Sheridan, up in Rogers Park. I don't think they have ever claimed Capone went there, but they would actually be telling the truth. This was actually the building Capone lived in 1922 and into 1923. This one we can actually document. In the early 1920s, he took out a gun permit and used this as his address, 6832 North Sheridan. In the 1950s, his brother Ralph testified before Congress in the Organized Crime Commission and said, when I first moved to Chicago, I lived with my brother at Farwell and Sheridan. And just recently I found that in 1985, Edward Saltiel, who was a state senator and a lawyer, gave an interview for like an oral history project. And then he said, hey, did I ever tell you that Al Capone lived upstairs from me? And he was living in 22. He lived at 6832 North Sheridan and said, yeah, there's a name on the mailbox, Capone, for the third floor. And my brother said, I bet that's Tony Capone, the prize fighter. But then one day, all these 7 cabs and a couple of Cadillacs pulled up, like bringing bottle after bottle inside of this place. Now, some of his memory was a little bit faulty, but it's another little tidbit about Capone being up in this place, just putting it together. But at the time, even when the gun permit was first published, the Chicago Daily News said it seems very weird that a person would live in Rogers Park if they were the manager of the Four Deuces on South Wabash. But a lot of the gangsters actually had places around Rogers Park and West Ridge. Like Dino Banyan lived by Rose Hill Cemetery on Ridge. Joe Aiello lived over in West Ridge. Big Tim Murphy was about 2 blocks south of him on Morse. But Capone came to Chicago. We'll got to go through his career here. Al Capone came to Chicago somewhere between 1919 and 1921, depending on which version of the story you're hearing. He was working for John Torrio, who had been brought in to be a bodyguard for Big Jim Colosimo, who was the guy who ran most of the vice operations in Chicago in the 1910s. Capone was put in charge of managing at least one of Torrio's places, and he had brothels all over the place, all over the south side, all over the south suburbs, and out into Cicero. But at 2222 South Wabash was the Four Deuces, which was officially a furniture store. I've generally reported the first time Capone came up in the papers as late August of 1922. I actually found a slightly earlier one, mid-August of 1922. There was an article about the Four Deuces in a Slovenian newspaper. And I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this, but you can see the very first word there. You can probably translate yourself. First word of the subhead, Venerikna. Really, the article is the Four Deuces was highly recommended as a place to go if you wanted to get a venereal disease. But then a couple of weeks after that article was published, the first Al Capone article appeared in the Chicago newspapers, August 31, 1922, Alfred Capone. And they kept calling him Capone like the whole time he was in Chicago, off and on. Alleged owner of the Four Deuces brothel at 2222 Wabash will face charges of assault with an automobile, driving while intoxicated, and carrying concealed weapons in Harrison Street Court this evening. Capone's machine struck a taxi cab driven by Fred Krause early yesterday morning. Krause was injured so badly that hospital attention was necessary. Capone jumped from his machine, pulled a revolver, flashed a deputy sheriff's badge, which you could buy pretty cheap at the police station, and threatened to shoot one of the witnesses who declared the accident had been Capone's fault. Taken to Central Station, Capone threatened the arresting officer with immediate discharge and promised his pull would make things unhealthy for his prosecutors. I'll fix this thing so easy you won't know how it's done, he is alleged to have boasted. He was later locked up and bailed out. This did, in fact, get cleared up before anything happened, but my God, what an asshole. Really, this is the kind of guy Capone really was. Working under Torrio, he just learned much better public relations. Torrio was the kind of guy who would have taught him to stop saying, "Are you looking for trouble?" and start saying, "We don't want any trouble." Really, it was just a matter of survival. But when Capone was booked, they would have taken him here to the Central Police Station. That was in City Hall. And City Hall is still standing, so we can say beyond doubt Capone was in this building. I'm always trying to find stuff like that. Eventually, once I started doing this lecture, I realized I got to put this into a book. So there'll be a book before too long. Like, where was Al Capone really? Jenna suggested I make it like a Where's Waldo book. But he's only actually in the places he really was. So 1924, on a couple of occasions, he was brought in to the criminal court building. That's the one that is still standing on Hubbard Street for interviews with the state's attorney, William McSwiggan. You can see pictured over there. This guy, William McSwiggan on the right there, this guy's like 25 in that picture. Capone is also like 23 in this shot. So this was when Capone's brother Frank was shot out in Cicero. By this time, things had gotten a little bit tough with Prohibition in Chicago in the early 1920s before Mayor Big Bill Thompson came back. So Torrio moved everything out to Cicero, really. But in one of the election buildups in Cicero, Frank Capone was shot by the police. This is Capone in the criminal court building talking at the inquest. They're rerunning the picture to go with another article. So a few months later in 1924, in a Jaime Jacobs Saloon at 2300 South Wabash, a guy named Joe Howard there in the middle was having a drink. Somebody came in. Howard said, "Hello, Al." And whoever this Al character was shot Joe Howard 6 times. Officially, this was never solved, but I don't think anybody doesn't believe that Al Capone was the trigger man here. But once again, he would have had to go into the state's attorney's office to answer questions about it, and that again was in the building that is still standing, the criminal court. But again, they had moved by this time. Most of their operations were going on out in suburban Cicero. This is a recent picture. Visit fabulous Cicero, Illinois. Play slots, win big. I think that's the town motto right now. It's like, I have never been to a town that had more ads for slots. Everywhere you go in Cicero, like every gas station, every diner has giant signs about play slots, win big. But on 22nd Street, just around, just a couple of blocks away from this, was the Hawthorne Hotel and Hawthorne Smoke Shop, above which was Tony the Greek's restaurant. These are places Capone actually did hang out. These are places he actually did have his own booth. This is a place where he actually did have mysterious panels that he could open up and there'd be a gun inside. Here's the current side of it. It's a parking lot now. Ain't that always the way? But there were a couple of murders here. This is late 1920s, not the more famous one. I just love this picture. It's a picture that you can see it's the Pony Inn and Cafe, and you can see that it's a seafood joint, officially. Really, it was a gambling den, but also a seafood place. And this is after a different murder took place there, and everybody gathered around to smile. This is something I find quite a lot with 1910s, 1920s Chicago murders. The next day in the paper, there's a picture of the scene of the crime with a whole bunch of people just standing around going like... I love this guy on the left here. He's like from the opening of Cheers or something. But this is what it looked like in 1926, this building. And this was shortly after Capone became the kingpin. Now, for the first few years of Prohibition, Torrio had just divided up the city, but for a while, Dino Banyan, the head of the North Side gang, kept trying to move into his territory, and eventually Torrio got annoyed enough that he wanted to take him out. He didn't, though, because the head of the Unione Siciliana, the Sicilian civic organization that was becoming very, very powerful politically, was so powerful that Mike Merlot, the head of the Unione Siciliana, said, "I don't want any killings," so even Torrio didn't dare to go against that. But then Mike Merlot died of natural causes. And it was actually the people who shot Dino Banyan were in the flower shop that he ran as his day job. They were ostensibly there to get flowers for Mike Merlot's funeral when they shot him to death. This kicked off the big gang war. About a month later, in early 25, somebody shot at Capone's car, though he wasn't in it at the time. A couple of days later, John Torrio was getting out of his own car by his house down in the 7000s of South Clyde, and Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and Vinny the Schemer Drucci assaulted him, shot him in the face. Miraculously, he survived. But he turned everything over to Capone at that point, but by then Capone was already a marked man. He had to travel with bodyguards everywhere he went. He was spending a great deal of his time just out here in Cicero. This is the same building as it looks today. It was a secret gambling parlor back then. One day in spring of 1926, about a year after Capone had taken over, he got word that Jaime Weiss and a couple members of the Miles O'Donnell gang, not to be confused with the Spike O'Donnell gang, were at this place, the Pony Inn, just a few blocks away from the Hawthorne. They had recently poached this place. This had been a Capone place, but the O'Donnells had come in and offered to sell them beer for slightly cheaper per barrel. So they had switched over. Capone got word that this was going on, and according to one witness pulled a Tommy gun out of a secret panel in the Hawthorne. And Tommy guns were brand new at the time. Nobody had really heard about these things yet. You occasionally hear that you could just buy them at Ace Hardware back then, and you had to prove that you were a government agent in order to be able to do it. It was a lot harder than people think. Capone had a lot of trouble getting these things. But he said, all right, let's see how how to do this. Went and shot up the car of the O'Donnell gang and probably thought that he was killing Jaime Weiss. But there had been a mistake. It wasn't Jaime Weiss who had with them. It was actually State's Attorney William McSwiggan. Now, exactly what William McSwiggan, this guy that they thought was like the golden boy of the law, was doing hanging out with the O'Donnell gang has never been adequately explained. There's some story that he was just childhood friends with them and they hung out a lot. So he might have been on a fact-finding mission or something. More likely, he was on the payroll of multiple gangs at the time and went in there just to assure the bartender, see, I'm the state's attorney. If I'm here, obviously everything is all right. And then he was shot down. Now, Capone disappeared for a couple of months, which gave people time to investigate all of his places. They went through Ralph Capone's place and found, like, guns being used as curtain rods, gun hidden in all kinds of hidden panels. They also found a couple of bookkeeping ledgers that would eventually be used against him in a court of law. This is really probably his biggest mistake, and it was probably an accident. Over and over, when Capone came back to town in July, he told everybody, Billy McSwiggan was my friend. I just gave him a bottle of scotch for his old man. Now, later on, about a year later, he even said, why would I have killed him? I paid him. I paid him plenty, and I was getting what I was paying for. Now, this is sometimes portrayed as Capone having a press conference to say these things. This was, there was a Netflix show, How to Become a Mob Boss. I was one of the talking heads on it, and they kept wanting me to say that Capone had a press conference right there on the courthouse. And I kept not doing it because I knew there wasn't actually a press conference for this sort of thing. They did get Jonathan Eig, who wrote the Get Capone book, one of the better ones, and he just looks and says, so Capone held a press conference right on the courthouse steps. The courthouse in City Hall does not have steps. I think when we picture Capone having this meeting on the courthouse steps, we're actually thinking of the Gotham City Hall. Really, I can think of a lot of different, like, in my mind when I think of somebody having a press conference about crime on the steps of the courthouse. I can picture a lot of things, but it's all from Batman movies. All of it. But really, he gave that quote that I was paying him and I paid him plenty, was given to a woman named Patricia Doherty, who I think should be better known. There are a lot of these women reporters. Almost every story I get into, there are women who wrote primarily for the Hearst papers, because Hearst was very good about bringing in women writers. He believed that women writers brought in women readers. So he had people like Evelyn Campbell back in the 1900s. He had people like Annie Laurie in the years before that. Patricia Doherty was only about 18 when she started working for the Hearst papers, but she immediately became the gangster Big Tim Murphy's favorite. He would always have her come over for an interview right while his gang was shooting somebody else up. She would have to testify on the trials sometimes that, no, he couldn't have been at the shooting. I was in his office at the time that it happened. So she was brought in. This quote that Capone gave about McSwiggan was actually given in the Hawthorne Hotel. She had to go through a whole bunch of bodyguards for it. This was in a couple of newspapers. She really wrote it for Cosmo. It's a pretty interesting article, too, but Capone just going right into his whole thing about, I'm just a humble businessman. I want us to stop killing each other. I'm sick of all of this killing all the time. And shortly after he said that, there was an attempt at a peace conference. Capone didn't go himself. It would have been at the Sherman Hotel, which is right where the Thompson Center is now. Capone didn't go, but he sent Tony Lombardo to negotiate, and they said, yeah, we want peace too, but you got to turn over Scalise and Anselmi, those guys who've been shooting at us. And Lombardo said Capone wouldn't do that to a yellow dog, so the whole thing fell apart, and a couple of weeks later, Jaime Weiss was shot to death outside of Holy Name Cathedral. This is something you hear on an awful lot of tours, that there's a bullet hole in Holy Name Cathedral that you can still see today. And this is right after the shooting. You can see there were some bullet holes at the time, but you can also see they're standing in front of this spot that is now covered up with stairs. Now, there is the part up at the top that says AD 1871. You can see in this picture, that's where the bullet holes would have been, but they've got them filled in pretty well now. Up at the above at the top is the thing they always say is a bullet hole. It's really, there was like a tube that was related to the lighting of the sign that was held up there, as I understand it. But by this time, really, Capone had moved out to the Metropole Hotel. This was down on South Michigan Avenue, kind of close to where the Lexington would be later on. He had a suite of rooms in this place. This is where he really held the party. It's long since torn down now. But after Jaime Weiss was killed, he gave another interview to Patricia Doherty and said, listen, I want peace. I'm tired of this. We're a bunch of saps shooting at each other like this. Then the North Side gang read that, called Capone up and said, all right, let's just meet just the four of us. It was, according to Capone at least, it was just him, Jaime Weiss, a guy named Barney Birch, who was like an elder statesman of the gang. He'd been around as a pickpocket since the days of the World's Fair. And a guy named Maxie Eisen. So they just sat down and said, listen, this is ridiculous, making a shooting gallery out of ourselves. Let's just go back to what we were doing before, where it was all divided up into territories. The next morning, he called up Patricia and said, we agreed to it. It's peace. I slept in my own bed for the first time in years last night. I drove by myself for the first time in years last night. We finally got a gang truce. And it's all because they read what you wrote in the Herald Examiner. I'm a little bit shaky on some of these quotes. You know, newspapers love to write compliments to themselves into their papers. But Capone felt safe enough coming out of Cicero then to get himself an office here in the Metropole Hotel. The North Side gang actually got themselves an office in the Loop. It would have been right where Block 37 is now. And officially the name of the business they operated there was Acme Productions. They would drive around in vans that said Acme Seamless Tube Company, which I guess is something you sell to coyotes. Yeah, we got to make a Warner Brothers reference here. But there was also the Aiello gang, which was kind of operating independently. Joe Aiello lived up in the West Ridge area. His mansion is still standing right by Indian Boundary Park. And about a year after that peace conference, the Aiellos tried to kill Capone. They had set up in this place the Atlantic Hotel that overlooked a cigar shop run by old Hinky Dink Kenna that apparently Capone was a regular at. This would have been at about right about where Clark and Adams is now. Long gone, but apparently Capone was enough of a sace there that they felt good setting up machine guns just in case he showed up. And when Capone found out about this, he went right into the office of the Acme Production Company, here where Block 37 is now, and it went to say, hey, what's the big idea? There was only one guy in the office that day. Everybody else was gone, and the guy just kind of stalls, well, gee, I don't know. I think the Aiellos are independent. They're not working with us. That was a lie. But Capone was unconvinced but left in peace. But he gave a lot of interviews to women reporters. He gave an interview to Genevieve Forbes Herrick from the Chicago Tribune. It wasn't particularly interesting. He gave a really good one to Sissy Patterson, a granddaughter of Mr. Medill of the Chicago Tribune. There have been a number of biographies written about Sissy Patterson over the years, most of which talk a lot more about her love life than they do about her work as a newspaper editor, which is probably for the best. If we get into her politics, she was really, really awful. This was a very good one. She happened upon him at his estate in Miami. This is a little bit later on in the timeline. And just kind of caught him outside, said, hey, would you talk? And he said, sure. And then she asked him, why in the world would you want to live in Chicago? That place is the worst. It's so cold there. He said, and then she said, well, why don't you just go back to Italy? And he got kind of mad there and said, I'm not from Italy. I was born in New York 31 years ago. And she said, you're 31? Because he looked a great deal older than that even then. She closed this article by saying, women have a certain affinity for gangsters. If you don't understand why, consult Dr. Freud. But 1928, by this time, after the whole thing with the Aiellos shooting at him, he decided, you know what, I'm getting out of Chicago. He tried to go to L.A. for a minute, but that was too hot for him. Back to Chicago for a minute, and then down to Miami, where he got his famous estate. He spent most of 1928 at his estate in Miami, but he came back in September for a couple of things. He came back in September for one thing, because Tony Lombardo, his top lieutenant, had been shot right at Dearborn and Madison. And it was thought to be by the Aiello gang at the time, but Capone came back mainly for the funeral. But while he was in town, he went down to Burnham to do some golfing with a set of rifles in his golf bag, just in case. Now, there's an obvious problem with walking around with rifles in your golf bag, and that is that you might accidentally shoot yourself in the groin. So this was in the papers the next day. They denied it all later on. They said that he was shot in his right and left legs and in the groin. And they said, oh, no, that wasn't him. That was some other fellow, greatly exaggerated. But it came out in his prison records that, no, this was true. He actually shot a hole in his scrotum. So I've been trying to pinpoint exactly where in the golf course in Burnham this would have been, down in the south suburbs, where Al Capone went golfing and shot a hole in two. Ba-dum-bum. But also in 1928, about the end of July of that year, he was back to move his operations over to the Lexington Hotel. This is the place where Geraldo would eventually go digging and trying to find a vault down in the basement. And while he was back in came back in town again in 1929, shortly after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 1929, not too far from here. I drove by the site on my way here today. 7 guys affiliated with the Moran Gang, 5 gangsters and a couple of bystanders were shot to death, lined up against the wall and shot. Capone was conveniently in Miami at the time, and of course always said that he had nothing to do with it. Every year there's a new theory about what really happened there. When Capone came back to town the next month briefly, he did go to the Federal Building to answer questions about it. This would have been right where all of this stuff is now. Currently the Mies van der Rohe Building, at the time, it was this old thing that I always say is like a state capitol on top of a museum. You can tell this is a later one. You can see the Board of Trade building right in the background of this. You can see the Clark Adams building right in the background of this. Right around the corner would have been that cigar shop that he apparently went to sometimes. But while he was here, he also was seen by a newspaper reporter going across the street to have lunch at his lawyer's office in the Marquette building. So he can trace it to the Marquette building. He had lunch there one time in an office. But shortly thereafter, he allegedly went to Atlantic City for a gang conference, a big peace conference that made Torrio the grand winner of everything, even though he was long out of business by then. But then he went to Philadelphia and was arrested for illegal weapons possession right off the train. So he did almost a year in jail in Philadelphia right at the height of his power, and a lot of people suspected that this was all probably part of his plan. It was a lot harder for somebody to kill him in a jail in Philadelphia. And of course, after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, all bets were off. Surely there were people going out for revenge. It was when he was released from that jail that he made the cover of Time magazine. And they didn't interview him or anything like that at the time, but by then, really, things were already starting to wane. Miami didn't want him back at that point. No other place really wanted him back. So he just kind of set up at the Lexington Hotel again. And he had there's a lot of different accounts of exactly which room was his or which floor was his, because nobody exactly seemed to remember. There's also a lot of accounts about what his desk was like. He had a desk up against the wall. Behind it were portraits of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. And then a third picture it is sometimes said to be Big Bill Thompson, the mayor, and sometimes said to be Al Capone himself going golfing. Probably they just changed the third picture around now and then. But one guy, Frank Lesh, who was head of the Chamber of Commerce Secret Six, the committee that just kind of drove Capone out of business by making business too hard for them to do, visited Capone there, had a little chat with them. His own version of what pictures were on the wall changed depending on who he was talking to at the time. So even the most reliable people were not always totally reliable. But it was around this time that Capone was put on trial for tax evasion. And that would have all taken place over here at the Federal Building once again. And in the middle of it, when he had days off from the trial, he started going to sporting events, which led to this one famous picture of him talking to Gabby Harnett of the Chicago Cubs. This was not at Wrigley Field, though. It was actually an exhibition game for charity, the Cubs versus the Sox at Comiskey. So I feel like maybe he went to a Cubs game, but we don't actually have photographic evidence of it. About a week or two later, he went to a football game at Ryan Field in Northwestern, which was still standing until just barely recently, a place we could actually trace Capone. He went there towards the end of his trial and got roundly booed there. In fact, when things got slow during the game, people would just turn around and boo Al Capone some more. Which really shows you, by the time he was on trial, his power in Chicago was very much on the wane. But, of course, as everybody knows, he was convicted and sentenced to, ended up in Alcatraz eventually for tax evasion. One other place that I can trace him is Dearborn Station. I sometimes point this out on my boat tours because you can, people always ask me, which of these buildings was Al Capone in? And, I would always say for the years, I said probably none of them. But there is a brief period on the boat tour where if you look down the road, you can see the Tower of Dearborn Station. He changed trains here on the way to prison. And Elliot Ness was present. That is probably the only time that Al Capone and Elliot Ness were actually in the same place at the same time. So now we're going to play a little game here. I'm going to show some Chicago buildings, and we'll just take a hand. Carbide and Carbon. Was Al Capone here? No, not as far as I know. I don't think he needed any carbide or carbon that he wouldn't have just sent somebody else for. How about Willoughby Tower? Was Al Capone here? Actually, this one he was. Let me scroll back. I got to check some of my notes. A lot of the best stuff I was ever able to find was really stuff in his trial transcript. It came out in the trial transcript that there was a guy named A. Sulka who came and said that Al Capone bought all of his pajamas from his shop. And he had receipts and everything. A. Sulka's shop took up the entire third floor of Willoughby Tower. Capone was buying French pajamas that cost $50 a pair. In 1920s money. That's well over $1,000 pajamas today. And he'd buy about 10 at a time. The Marshall Field. Was Al Capone here? I can tell who's been on my tours. I think he was here. Several people from Marshall Field testified that he bought things like monogram shirts and his union suits, his underwear that was made out of ladies' glove silk. Which cost him about $20 a pair. That's $500 or $600 if you adjust for inflation. Really nice underpants. But I'm not 100% sure he was in the building. One of the tailors testified that he went to measure Capone at the Metropole Hotel. So it could have been all just a house call, too. Essex Inn. Was Al Capone here? He couldn't have been. This place was built in 1961. But he was on the spot where it now stands. On the spot where it stands was Jack Niles Furniture, where Capone bought a lot of the furniture that he had sent down to his estate in Miami. So, kinda. Or how about the Jewelers Center? There's a lot of mix on this one. Yeah, this one he was definitely into. It was the Jewelers Center, which I think might be, this came up in the trial, it might be why people thought he was in the Jewelers building. The Jewelers Center at Mahler Tower, he bought about $6,000 worth of jewelry and furniture from A.J. Quint, who had the whole of the third floor of this place. The Field Building. Was Al Capone here? No, not that I know of. Board of Trade. Was Al Capone here? No, not that I know of either. Same with the Rookery over there on the left. I'd love it if I could trace him to the Rookery. That would be great. I can trace H.H. Holmes to the Rookery. He had business with a couple of offices that were in there. But a lot of the other places that we can really trace him to, even the ones that are standing, are kind of surprising, like this place in Andersonville, uptown Andersonville vicinity. This was, let me find that, 5450 North Broadway, perilously close to the Green Mill. It has been a nursing home since the 1960s, but in the 1920s, it was a car dealership. And one of the dealers there testified and showed the receipts that in 1924, Mr. and Mrs. Capone came in and traded in their old Lincoln on a $12,500 McFarland touring car. This was at a time in 1924, Capone officially was making $75 a week working for Torrio, but was buying $12,500 cars. And the Safeguard Self-Storage Building in the 1300 block of South Wabash. This was also a furniture store that Capone actually did patronize. That came up in the trial. And this building here next to the Jerk Store. It would be a lot funnier if Capone had been at the Jerk Store. But this building next to it, which is all just covered in glossy bricks for years, they covered it up in the 70s. It was just recently rescued as a building. I'm not sure what's going to be happening with it. But this was an old bank building. And during the trial, one of the clerks there said that he let Capone in several times to go into the safety deposit area. The Greasy Thumb Gusick also had a safety deposit vault there. So this is where Al Capone's vault really was. And it is still standing. And for what it's worth, Deirdre, his grandniece, says she still thinks he's got about $100 million sitting around the city someplace. To find out where, you probably have to buy her book. Another place that is also still standing is the Sparbaro Undertaking Parlor. Mr. Sparbaro was a state's attorney, but also a bootlegger, and ran a funeral home on Wells Street where most of the big gangster funerals were held. Dino Banyan, Vinny the Schemer Drucci, I think Lombardo. It's reasonable to imagine Capone must have been at a couple of them. These things were massive affairs, though sometimes he just sent a card. But that building is still standing. And where did I put that picture? Right there. Still on Wells, and you can see the little green things on the side are still there, and they're in the old pictures of it from the 1920s. Geraldo went there too. And one restaurant that I could find that was, there's a few different stories about restaurants that he went to in early books like Fred Paisley's. They often mention Bella Napoli, which was Diamond Joe Esposito's restaurant at 850 South Halsted. Also long gone now, but it comes up in some stuff from the 1930s, but never really a first-hand account. There's a vivid story that after that Sherman Hotel Peace Conference, all of the gangsters went to Bella Napoli and just had a good meal, saying, hey, remember that night we tried to shoot you in the head? Oh, remember the night we broke one of your guys' heads open with a baseball bat? And just all had a good laugh over a meal. And again, it's only secondhand stuff, but it's generally said to have been Bella Napoli. One place that we can say for sure is a place called the Minerva Cafe, run by Lawrence Mangano. This was a place that Capone went to while the Aiellos were getting him. He had a conference with all of his men and said, no, listen, I'm still the boss around here. Then when he was back in town for Lombardo's funeral, he was reported there again, and this made the papers at the time. He went there, had a meal, and lost $10,000 playing craps. And that space is now right here at the overpass on Halsted, which is pretty generally how these things go. And most of the places we can really trace Capone to are just places that used to be furniture stores, places that used to be banks, restaurants, almost never, clubs where he might have gambled, almost never. Really, there weren't too many places by the time he was really making enough money that he could really party in these places outside of the area immediately around the Four Deuces. We could trace him to a few other places around there, a few other places around Cicero for sure, but most of them are long since torn down now. There's not really any trace there, just places around what is now Chinatown. But it's still fascinating to me. I mean, I wouldn't get a tattoo of this guy. I can see through his entire act about what a humble guy he was, and he was just a businessman, and for no reason everybody was always dragging him into stuff. But I love the treasure hunt aspect of trying to find these places, trying to sort out fact from fiction, trying to figure out what is really going on with this and where he really was and where some of these stories came from. I really would like to find out where that milk bottle story came from anyway. At least where it got started. All right, if you want to follow along with more of my stuff, I'm making pretty good progress turning all of this stuff into a book, a little guidebook of extant buildings, lost buildings, places he wasn't really, but they say he was there. I got into it thinking, oh, this will make a good pamphlet-sized book. No, this will be a pretty good-sized thing. So you can follow along with all of that and all of my other research. I'm working on Volume 2 of the Graceland Cemetery book this spring. I'll be at the History Museum tomorrow going through a couple of old scrapbooks for a guy that I found there. And you can follow along with all of this stuff, and I'll probably put up the Where Was Capone book first as like a free PDF for Patreon subscribers. So there's always cool stuff going on that, and walking tours should start up again in the next couple of months. Any questions at this point? Oh, well, first, yeah. Yes, give me adulation, yes.